This is John Reed, Professor of Psychology at the University of East London.
Mm-hmm.
We have known each other for quite some years now, and I know that you have done very interesting work on electroshock, and this is not something a psychologist does. Electroshock his patients. So can you tell us, why do you have this interest?
Well, I guess it goes back to when I was a nursing aide in the Bronx many, many years ago, and in a psychiatric unit. And every Monday, Wednesday and Friday afternoon there'd be this row of old people, mostly women, sat in the corridor waiting to go into this room, and when they came out they were unconscious and wheeled off, and I was just fascinated, so I asked if I could see what was going on, and so I got to see ECT given, and I remember that first time the medical students were invited as well, and the doctor invited the medical students to whether they'd like to press the button. I invited all of us. I think he thought I was a student as well, a medical student, and all 6 of them stepped forward to want to press the button. I ended up in the car park throwing up, being sick. So there was something, either something wrong with me or something, I think you call it a gut reaction. Anyway, then it became my job to sit with these women. They mostly were women and mostly 60 or 70 years old. After they'd had the ECT, and it was my job to help them slowly come back to reality. And I found that quite distressing, as they did, because the very last question they always asked me after I'd help them remember their name and where they were and everything, the last question sometimes they would ask, well, why would they do that to me? And I didn't have an answer for that. So anyway, that was going a long way back to how I got interested in it. And one other story before we come on to the research. In my very first job as a qualified clinical psychologist in the Midlands here in England, somebody died from ECT on the table. No question. We had killed him, we the team. In fact, it was written in his chart, heart condition, ECT contraindicated. So the next day at the team meeting, I tried to raise this and was told to be quiet. We're not discussing that. How dare you accuse us of doing anything wrong? And when I insisted that we have to talk about it, I was removed from the team meeting physically as a qualified professional clinical psychologist. I then went and copied that note, ECT contraindicated, heart condition, knowing what would happen next, because the next day that note was missing from the records.
Oh, they deleted it?
They took the page and got rid of it, but I had a copy of it. And for the next 2 years, I tried to get the hospital, the National Health Service, the professional psychiatry to take any action, some action, and I failed. So those are my 2 stories about how I became interested in ECT, but anecdotal stuff. But since then, I've done a number of reviews of the scientific literature about ECT. But
yes, and I have read some of it and enjoyed it. And when you talk about ECT, the official psychiatric narrative is very misleading. I remember that the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK, they had a fact sheet where they said that over 80% of patients benefit from ECT, and there are not really any memory problems to worry about. And this is almost as wrong as it can be, but I will leave it to you to explain why.
Well, since you raised that, we have one of the things we've done some audits of the information leaflets that are used around the country here in England, and also Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, and they are appallingly misleading. Not just the one put out by the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the ones that are used around the country. They make misleading claims about its efficacy, about its safety. They claim that it is the most effective treatment for depression. They say the memory loss is temporary, and if there is any, it's caused by the depression, not by the ECT. And they are just extraordinarily misleading. So it means that the principle of informed consent is being broken on a regular basis here in Britain. I'm going to guess it's the same in the States, but I don't think anybody's done an audit of the information leaflets there.
But I remember that you have written somewhere that ECT kills 1 patient per 1,000 who are treated. But the American Psychiatric Association has an estimate that it is only 1/10 of what you have written about.
I haven't written that it is 1 in 1,000. I've summarised all the studies showing that it is a much higher rate of mortality than the official rate the American Psychiatric Association first put out 30 or 40 years ago. That 1 in 10,000 has been regurgitated. There's never been any evidence for that. It's been regurgitated by the by the British Royal College of Psychiatry, all sorts of organisations. They just keep regurgitating it. But when you look at the studies, there's a range of studies. We really don't know is the bottom line, because it's so poorly researched. There was one that had it at 1 in 1,000. There's some that are even higher than that. The most interesting study, well, in a way the most interesting study, is the only study done by a profession other than psychiatry, which was done by anaesthetists, found that 1 in 15 had a life-threatening adverse effect, mostly cardiac.
1 in 15?
Didn't die, but 1 in 15 had a life-threatening adverse effect. 1 died in their study. It was about 200 people, I think, something like that. But the minimisation of the mortality rate, and more commonly the minimisation of the memory loss is quite astonishing. I mean, just last year, 2 Chinese studies on adolescents, hundreds of adolescents in each study, found memory loss in 67 and 68% of these kids, mostly girls. And they described that level of memory loss as acceptable, a high level of safety. They described that. So one has to wonder what would be an unacceptable level of safety. But to be fair, at least they were acknowledging that it was that high. But then they went on to say that was okay. And these are in the developing brains of children. It's astonishing. But most of our reviews, I've done 4 now, 4 peer-reviewed reviews, are focused more on the efficacy of ECT. It's quite an astonishing body of literature, and very people pay attention to it, partly because the numbers are quite small. I mean, most people interested in problems with psychiatry focus on the big number, antidepressants, antipsychotics. But also the only people researching ECT are the pro-ECT people. Nobody else looks at it. It's like this other world going into it. There has not been a single randomized controlled placebo study of ECT since 1985. 1985, that is nearly, 40 years?
But could I comment on schizophrenia, for example?
Yeah.
There is a Cochrane review on ECT for schizophrenia that I have read, and it doesn't work for schizophrenia. It doesn't work at all.
There's been no randomized controlled trials for ECT for depression, 3 since the turn of the century for schizophrenia. Interestingly, Africa, India and South America, Europeans and Americans are not even willing to research it. Strange. Yes, no difference whatsoever between placebo group and the ECT group, either immediately afterwards or at follow-up. It doesn't matter. They carry on doing it anyway. It makes no difference.
This is so otherworldly that I know of no other medical specialty that defies the scientific evidence to the extent that we see in psychiatry. So we know that ECT doesn't work for schizophrenia, and yet people are forced to receive ECT because they are ill. They can't object against it. And some of them get permanent memory loss. They never become themselves again. And I can tell you a very moving story of a Danish nurse that I know and have met several times. When she was young, she was on vacation in Greece with another girl, and she was raped by a Greek man.
Yeah.
And it caused her such a tremendous trauma that she got diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia.
Oh dear.
She was not schizophrenic. She had an immense trauma because of the rape. And then, you wouldn't believe it, she got 150 electroshocks.
150?
Yes. And she got disability pension. Her life was ruined. But then one day she realized that maybe I should take my life back. And today she has come over it. She is well functioning, she has a job,
Okay.
she has got to terms with her big trauma, and the diagnosis was utterly wrong, and so was the treatment.
Well, that's wonderful that she's come out the other end. Unfortunately, a lot of people do not.
No.
The research isn't very good, unfortunately, because researchers don't seem to care very much about getting proper figures on this very important issue. But the best we can say is that between 12 and 55%, that's a big range, I know, but it's between 12 and 55% of people will end up with persistent or permanent memory loss, which is a huge, so let's say it's down the bottom end, 20% maybe, something like that.
This tells me something very important, and I know that you have the same feeling. We should do everything we can to convince politicians that ECT should be illegal. It should not happen.
Well, my position on that is that it should be immediately suspended until we have the proper research. So we might disagree slightly on that. The outcome would be the same, I believe, because if we ever did the proper research, we would find that it is no better than placebo, and we would get confirmation of how many people are really getting permanently brain damaged. I know they don't like the term brain damage, but if your brain is not working as it was before because of an intervention, it's damaged, so it's brain damage. So I call it brain damage. If we ever did that research, we would have to abandon it from an evidence-based point of view.
Could I kindly object a little to what you have just said?
Yes, you can.
We know that ECT causes brain damage. This has been shown in autopsy studies that it actually does damage the brain. And then psychiatrists say, oh, but ECT leads to new neurons being produced in the brain, and they take this as something positive, that more neurons are being produced in the brain. But the brain produces more neurons when it has been damaged.
That's right.
So it's absolutely the opposite. So what I'm going to suggest to you now, and you can think about it, I think we have more than enough research to say that no one should be exposed to ECT, because even for depression, it does not have any lasting effects, which is why people get one ECT after another, maybe 10 or 20 ECTs. If it worked, that would not be necessary. And we know that it is tremendously harmful because of the loss of memory. So what argument is there for doing more research rather than saying stop this madness and do it now? Let me ask you, with all the knowledge you have about ECT, that it seems to me to be a terrifying treatment. I mean, if I have a problem with my computer, I wouldn't send strong current through it, would I? That would probably destroy the computer. So how did people ever get the idea of ECT in psychiatry?
It's quite a fascinating story, the history of ECT. In the 1930s, there were a lot of what they called mutual exclusivity medical theories, which meant that if you had one illness, you couldn't have another one. And one of the pairs of illnesses was epilepsy and schizophrenia. So they genuinely believed, and you can read this in the medical journals, that if you had epilepsy, you couldn't have schizophrenia and vice versa. So they were trying to cure epilepsy by injecting people with epilepsy with the blood of schizophrenic people. And they were trying to cure schizophrenia by causing epilepsy, by causing convulsions. And they tried lots of different ways to do it. Insulin coma therapy, which is a dreadful process. And they landed on electricity to cause the convulsions. And they landed on it because the guy who actually invented it happened to be passing a slaughterhouse and saw the hogs being stunned into unconsciousness before they were killed. And he decided, let's try that on human beings and see if that causes the convulsions that we're looking for. That's the history of ECT. And people often ask me, how on earth did they come up with this bizarre idea that electrocuting brain cells that are equipped to deal with one tiny fraction of 1 volt, putting through 150 volts, how did they think this could possibly be a good idea? There's a second theory that they developed soon afterwards, which is that it works because it causes brain damage. So there were theories, and again, and you can read it in the medical journals, there's this wonderful paper called Brain Damaging Therapeutics, where a leading American psychiatrist, proponent of ECT at the time, Walter Freeman, writes about the more brain damage is a requisite for the cure, and the more damage we create, the greater the cure. And I remember this quote exactly, because some schizophrenics have too much brain in operation for their own good. Those are the two theoretical underpinnings. And we could look back and almost laugh at that if we weren't still doing it 80, 90 years later. It's astonishing. My prediction, for what it's worth, would be about 10 or 15 years. Other treatments that have been believed to be effective at the time, which in hindsight were utterly ridiculous, like lobotomies or going further back, rotating chairs and surprise bars and standing people next to cannon fires, an endless list of bizarre things that at the time people genuinely thought were helpful, have disappeared. ECT will, I give it 10 or 15 years, but what's going to make the difference is not the research. Psychiatry tends not to respond to research. I don't think by and large it's an evidence-based profession very much. But what's going to stop ECT is the legal cases that are taking place now in America. I know of 4 in America and 2 in Canada and 1 in Britain, all of which are progressing. I'm an expert witness in most of those. And I think once we start impacting the financial side of things, shall we put it, I think we will have a genuine impact and soon see the end of this treatment.
It's not an exaggeration to say that electroshock is a controversial treatment. And what should a patient or a patient's wife or husband or father or mother do if electroshock is suggested?
Well, the important thing is to inform yourself. And if you get all the information, which will include the fact that it might have a short-term temporary lift in mood, it may do that, but it won't have any lasting positive effects beyond the week or 2 after treatment. If you're willing to put up with the risk of permanent memory loss for life events like getting married or your kids growing up or whatever, and it doesn't happen to everybody, but it is a high risk, you've got to weigh that temporary lift in mood against the risk of that memory loss. And if you think that's worth it, then obviously it's not for me to say you shouldn't have it. But I do think people should get informed, and you need to read beyond the information that, I'm afraid to say this, but beyond the information that the ECT psychiatrists are likely to give you.
There is one thing more that in Denmark at least, and I think in most other countries, you have as a doctor a responsibility of telling people about very serious harms, even if they are very rare. Mm. And since we know that ECT kills some people, this must also be told to the patients that in rare cases you might die from this treatment before they decide whether to get it or not.
Yes, I think that's true. It is very rare, but it does happen. People need to be told that as well. Other things they need to know, Robert, on that they need to know that women are more likely to have the permanent memory effects, and as are older people. And unfortunately, those are the two target groups. Older women are the people most likely to get ECT. So people need to be told that, and to be told that bilateral ECT, when you have the electrodes on both sides of the head, are much more likely to cause the permanent memory loss than the unilateral, which they know, but most people are still getting bilateral.
And then I have a final question. Some people cannot refuse to get ECT. For example, if they have schizophrenia or severe depression and are admitted to a psychiatric department against their will, they might be forced to get ECT. So what do you think about that?
I think that's wrong. I think that's ethically wrong, professionally wrong, medically wrong, scientifically wrong. And the best advice at that point, if you can afford it, is to get a lawyer and fight. If the family or whoever the group around the person is decides that they don't want to have it, then you need to get a lawyer, because this is actually a human rights issue. There's no other branch of medicine where you can be forced to have a treatment of any kind, never mind a treatment that is likely to cause permanent brain damage.
Or that might even kill you if you are unlucky.
Indeed.
So there is something to work on here, and really much, in fact. And I'm very grateful for your time, John.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for everything you've done over the years to fight this fight. I want to say one last thing. It's the hardest fight there is, I think, but you meet the best people.
You do.
And I'd like to include you in that.
You do. You surely do. Yes.